It's not just that she's scoring goals. We've seen a lot of fabulous goals in the league this season. And even against just that goal against Houston this weekend where she just puts it top bins and then hits the celebration. That's just charisma to the max. And that's how you go from being a star to a superstar. And it's been so fun to see Trinity Rodman go from star to superstar this year. And I think the sky is only the limit. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Monday, September 16th. And we're going to do big picture, small picture today. I think we're going to take a deep look into a couple of teams in the NWSL, a couple of teams in the WNBA, talk about some of the big individual records broken in the dub this week and sort of what that means for the big picture of the league. And a couple nice shout outs at the end. We're going to keep this volleyball discussion going. And I also want to shout out the U.S. Women's National Team U20s who did something so crazy this week that it made me look dumb just from watching it. So shout out to what we got going on this week. There's a lot of good stuff. Okay, so let's chat some NWSL. We had a couple really interesting matchups this weekend. I think the approach today is going to be honing in on a couple individual matchups that I think are maybe indicative of some big picture stuff. We're not going to do a whole rundown because we're not seeing a ton of motion. We're always seeing kind of teams maybe hop in, hop out those final couple spots of the playoff line, and we'll talk about the playoff picture a little bit. And we've got a couple. We had another really nice matchup near the top of the table, but also it ended in a draw, so we didn't have too much movement there. But I think we had kind of a nice swath this week of games that were good indicators of how week to week you do sometimes have matches that are indicative of, like I said, sort of that big picture. You watch a game, like one single game, and go, I feel like this is indicative of one team's like larger trajectory for a year, or more indicative of what issues they're dealing with behind the scenes or something like that. But also sometimes in NWSL, you see a game and you go, this is just a soccer game and there's no really big picture crazy stuff here. So maybe let's talk about the socceriest game that occurred, which was this great matchup between Orlando and Kansas City, number 1 versus number 3. Kansas City going to Orlando to try to maybe get some revenge for that sort of high emotion loss at home against Orlando right before the regular season Olympic break. Instead, they share the spoils. It is a scoreless draw, which ain't that just how soccer goes. You think you're going to be getting some fireworks. You maybe come in with all of these different narratives, but regular season soccer is like this, right? But that does not mean it was not a good game. It was actually a really interesting game, more of a chess match between two really confident sides who know how they want to play. Very soccer-y game for soccer nerds tactically. But maybe that is the point, right? Is that when you can take all of these different moments throughout the season, making the larger picture of what this season means for Orlando, who are still on this historic unbeaten run, or what this means for Kansas City, where it's been a little bit more of a complicated story in recent weeks. You did have a moment maybe to pause going into this game, thinking about, okay, what was our mindset between these two teams before that Olympic regular season break? It was a little fraught, right? They both went into that game before the Olympic break unbeaten. Kansas City was hosting. Orlando goes to Kansas City. They hand them a loss. It was a little bit fraught, right? There was talk of sportsmanship, and Kansas City's players took it pretty hard, and they didn't like the way that Orlando's players behaved maybe during or after that game. And they said, okay, we're going to get them back next time. But you make it to this game, and Orlando is still on this incredible winning streak. I mean, I do think it is notable that Kansas City got a result out of this at all. Orlando has not only been unbeaten. There was so much about talking about the unbeaten streak, but even talking about the draws that they got earlier in this season, they had been on a winning streak since June in NWSL regular season. But there is this different energy. Kansas City comes out of that. They've lose 3 games in a row, dating back to that game against Orlando before the Olympic break. They just finally pull out of that skid last week against one of the teams who are not in playoff contention. This is their chance to kind of prove themselves against a playoff contender, or obviously another Shield contender. The short losing streak, I do think, took a little bit of the steam out of this for Kansas City. I think they, maybe to their benefit, were focusing a little bit more on their own processes rather than focusing so much on what Orlando was doing, which was a main factor of that Orlando win prior to the Olympic break, which was that you saw Kansas City getting very, very frustrated by Orlando. So I thought that was an interesting kind of, again, sometimes it means a lot and sometimes it's just a soccer game. And I think this one was a little bit of both. Kansas City is also still moving people around a little bit. They started Kayla Sharples and Alana Cook at center back. Those are two new signings for them, right? They made trades to bring those in. They knew that they were going to be making defensive changes. They've had some injuries in the back line, and also just frankly, the back line has not been as sturdy as it probably should be. They make a goalkeeping switch. They move away from AD Franch as the starting goalkeeper. They're getting Nichelle Prince more involved in the attack. I like Nichelle Prince. I think she is at this point in her career more of a playmaker than a true scoring forward, but I think that it's good to get a player like that worked in. And then they also have Bia coming back from injury, and I think she made a major impact coming off of the bench. So them getting this result, even without Temwa Chawinga, who I at this point believe is going to be the Golden Boot winner and possibly break the single season scoring record, doing this without getting her on the score sheet, I think is a big positive. But there is also that question of if Chawinga isn't scoring, who is? So really interesting game, I think, for Kansas City, maybe more than Orlando, where Orlando is coming from this place of strength where they've been winning these games. They've been winning games in recent weeks without Barbara Banda scoring, which is also really good. You're showing some of their depth, some of their ability to get results. You know, again, even that game against Chicago last week where they just kind of have this wonder goal from Marta and that breaks the deadlock. You're seeing really nice finishing even when the build-up play isn't quite there. The vibes in Orlando are just so good. And I thought that it was interesting that they just kind of let this game play out in front of them. And they got into the motions that they wanted to get into. They got into the spaces that they wanted to get into. But this is maybe a little bit more of a test for them of, okay, we are the Shield favorites right now. We are the undefeated team. We do have the possibility of running the table this season. And then what does that mean for the postseason? This was a good test for them. Now, obviously, they don't want it to be 0-0, right? They want to win something like this in regulation. But what a good drill to kind of figure out what this looks like against a very stacked Kansas City team, getting that scoreless draw, getting the result. You kind of move on to next week. But I liked it. It shows a versatility to Orlando where we've seen teams like Orlando get hot in the past. You see teams go on these runs, but then they face adversity and they struggle to get a result. That didn't happen to Orlando this week. Was really impressed by them and continue to be. I do think they have the ability to make it through this season unbeaten. They have kind of a tough run in. There are 6 games left, and quite a few of those games for Orlando are against other people who are currently above the playoff line. But I don't know. I think it could happen. They keep showing different looks, different ways to do things. So I like that a lot. But I do want to make a point about Chawinga and Banda. Talk about, again, big picture versus just a soccer game. There's a really lovely series of photos that came out of this game after the match. It was a photo of Temwa Chawinga, Barbara Banda, Jericho, who plays for Kansas City, Grace Chanda, who plays for Orlando but is currently hurt, and Hilda Magaya, all just having a catch up. Now, these are all African players. And as we know, Kansas City and Orlando have such a large contingent of African talent. And it was pointed out to me earlier this year, and I think this is a good point to make about both of these teams, even if they aren't currently 1 and 2, because Washington is doing quite well as well. But they were on these dueling unbeaten runs earlier this season and still doing quite well. And neither team had anyone currently on the U.S. women's national team. The way that these two clubs have constructed these rosters and scouted intelligently and with nuance, and, you know, maybe, you know, Barbara Banda is an obvious one, but I mean, I talked to Haley Carter, general manager of Orlando, earlier this year about all of the things that she needed to get done just to even bring a player like Banda in. The Brazilian talent between these two teams and how you are seeing models of success in the NWSL that are not completely predicated on U.S. women's national team players. Now, U.S. women's national team players are very important. I don't think you can talk about Washington without talking about them. You can't talk about Gotham without talking about U.S. women's national team players. But I think that this is already a snapshot not only of where the league is now, where you're seeing clubs going out and finding players that are maybe being overlooked, or again, just finding talent from national teams in Africa, but also the future. Because with this new CBA where there's no draft and there's no maximum signing salary, I just think this is going to be what we see more and more. And I'm really excited about it. I think that Kansas City and Orlando should be very proud of what they constructed with international talent. And I think that other teams should also see that as a model where you put a little bit of the extra work in, you find those players, you bring them in, and you succeed. And there isn't only just one model for NWSL success, which has always been, I think, one of the big knocks at the top of the league, which is you go, yes, of course, they can beat each other, but how many U.S. women's national team players do they have, and why, and what support are they getting from the federation, and that, like, all these different things about how it's just meant to set up U.S. players. But I just don't think that's true anymore. And I just thought that was a lovely moment in NWSL, and I love those photos as well. Some other quick NWSL snapshots talking about Washington, talking about the U.S. women's national team. Trinity Rodman is hitting another level, not even just kind of on the pitch, but she keeps having these celebrations, and they've been kind of basketball themed recently. You know, the other week she did the alley-oop, like, slam dunk celebration with Magic Johnson. This week she does the night against the Houston Dash. It's a little bit of like her own spin on it. She doesn't just kind of just hit the Steph Curry night. She actually went all the way to the ground and put that team to bed. I love it. It's not just that she's scoring goals. We've seen a lot of fabulous goals in the league this season, and even against just that goal against Houston this weekend where she just puts it top bins and then hits the celebration. That's just charisma to the max, and that's how you go from being a star to a superstar. And it's been so fun to see Trinity Rodman go from star to superstar this year. And I think the sky is only the limit. And again, we're just seeing another really nice season being put together by Washington. They've also clinched playoffs. Orlando and Washington are the two teams that have clinched playoffs at this point. And I think both of those teams have a huge shot at a title this year. I also want to shout out Rodman's former partner in crime, Ashley Sanchez. She deserves to get, I think, some national momentum after another really strong game for North Carolina this weekend. She's having a very strong season for them. People might know Sanchez had a rough World Cup last year. She didn't play, and then she kind of fell out of the U.S. women's national team conversation after that. She gets traded to North Carolina, but then she just puts her head down and gets to work. And I think an interesting thing about Sanchez is the world around her has maybe changed, right? The U.S. looks very different than they did when Andonovski originally brought her in. She's on a different club team. She's just sort of walking in different circles these days, but she herself as a player has not changed. She is still the player that she was when she burst onto the U.S. women's national team scene, or when she did so well for the Washington Spirit and did have that tandem with Trinity Rodman. So I would like to see her get U.S. looks. I know it's a crowded position. Like, I know that attacking midfielder is a tricky spot to be in if you are an American player, but I also just think it should be noted that Ashley Sanchez didn't change. Everything else has changed, and she's continued to succeed in a new system on a new team. And I wanted to shout that out as well. I also want to give a shout out to Bay FC, another decent result this week. I don't know if that 8th spot holds. I'm very curious to see. We see some surging, and it's all so close together that individual, like I said, small picture becoming big picture. You see individual results become much more important, like Racing Louisville gets a big win this weekend, and that's very important after they'd had this sort of skid to drop out of playoff position. They're like only a couple points off the line. And then you've got Angel City, who was making that surge to get above the playoff line, and now they've stumbled a couple weeks in a row and they're falling back out. But Bay FC, I think you go to beginning of season to mid-season, and then mid-season to now, you can see the turnaround, and it's just a much more stable operation over there with what they're putting out on the pitch every week. And I think that there is an absolute possibility that they have some staying power here. It would be one thing if you were basing it off of the entire season, but I think with an expansion side, you really more have to do first half, second half. And second half, Bay looking pretty good. They're getting results. They're getting the results that they need. So I don't know what happens, especially with 7th and 8th, because I think it's a bit of a crapshoot. But I've liked what I've seen from the Bay, which leads us to the other major topic of conversation I wanted to talk about with NWSL this week, which is the Portland Thorns, who are currently in 6th. And I want to kind of circle that, maybe just with a pencil, not with a red pen just yet, just with a pencil, because the 6th that they are, we've talked a lot about, kind of that top 4, now maybe top 5. That top 4 was for a while. It was, it had Portland involved, and then you had Gotham in 5th, and then Gotham kind of leapfrogs them, and then now North Carolina has leapfrogged them. But if you take a look at the standings now, the 6th that Portland is closer to dropping out of playoff contention than competing for a shield. They are dropping significantly. They are on a 4-game losing streak in the regular season. And I keep saying that they're safe, right? They're safe. You look at it now, not so safe anymore. They're only a couple points above the playoff line, despite sitting in 6th. This is after a loss to Chicago, who is sitting in 7th at the end of the weekend. A 1-0 loss to Chicago, where Portland once again just doesn't look like the team that we have known them to be. I'm not even talking about like ancient history, just in the last couple of years. 2022, They just miss out on the Shield, but they win a championship. 2023, they just miss out on the Shield. They are used to contending for these trophies. And that is just not the team that we're seeing right now. And I think this is a good game against small picture, big picture. I think a game against Chicago is always a good time to check in with a team because Chicago is like the bellwether of the NWSL. No team has ever been more seventh, right in the middle, than the Chicago Red Stars this year. And I say this as a credit to them because I know it's been an uphill climb. They're a really good team for figuring out their opponent's deal. If you can beat Chicago handily, then I think you're a good team. If you struggle with Chicago, I think you're probably not a good team. If you are a talented team like Portland who cannot get a result against Chicago, that means something is going wrong. This is nothing against Chicago themselves. I think Chicago is very sturdy. I think they're kind of figuring out their rotations and they're working Mel Swanson back in. But I mean this in a positive way. Seventh means playoffs. So I mean this as a positive way for Chicago, but it also was just a very good bellwether game for the Thorns. Now, the Thorns, again, they're on a 3-game losing streak coming into this. They're at home. They have made sort of a formation shift slightly into a more conservative 4-2-3-1, which we saw play out against Washington last week. Now, they lose a heartbreaker to Washington in second half stoppage time. My takeaway from that was you shouldn't worry about the Washington game. You should worry about like a game like this one. Maybe you don't beat Washington. You should be beating Chicago if you are the Portland Thorns and you're looking at the roster that they have. Chicago doesn't do anything crazy to score in this game. It was a really poor piece of communication between midfielder Olivia Moultrie, defender Kelly Hubley, and goalkeeper Mackenzie Arnold. Ali Schagel pounces 1-0. And then Portland just couldn't really do anything about it. They had a lot of game left to try to figure out an equalizer, and you have Sophia Smith working as hard as she possibly can, she's ducking back into the midfield to defend. You see her making these tracking runs. She's trying to combine with someone like Moultrie, trying to combine with Hina Sagita, with Christine Sinclair, and just no one is quite in the right place at the right time. Of course, Chicago is very good at last-ditch defending, but the whole point, again, of a sturdy 4-2-3-1 is that you can be more methodical. You know how you want to progress the ball, which has been one of Portland's great weaknesses. And yet, after that mistake in the back, they looked kind of stressed when they were making this push to equalize. And those moments, again, where you can see that miscommunication between a player like Arnold and Hubley and Moultrie, and we've seen that Hubley and Sauerbrunn backline that was so sturdy a couple years ago really kind of struggle this season. And you bring new goalkeepers in because you're kind of on this goalkeeping carousel and you're still having trouble in the back. That indicates to me that the instruction is not necessarily there, or the expectations is not matching with the personnel that they're putting out on the pitch. But Portland also got their chances in this game. Their attack is really, really deep, but they also conceded a penalty that would have had them down 2-0 if Swanson hadn't had her penalty saved by Mackenzie Arnold. And also, hopefully, Mallory Swanson is okay. She went down with a shoulder injury in this game. I watched that fall like over and over again, trying to see if I could see anything. I think it was just kind of an awkward fall. Hopefully she'll be okay. And so this strange moment that Portland is in, where the on the field tweaks that manager Rob Gale, who is their permanent manager now, has implemented, all kind of makes sense, right? But the big picture feels like a team that's maybe suffering a death by 1,000 cuts. And maybe it's the roster changes. Maybe it's the coaching stasis after a rough start. They've kind of had this weird up and down where they had a really poor start to the season. They play very well for a period of time mid-season, and now they're falling off again, right? I look at the roster, right? You look at this game featured Natalia Kuika, who was on my shortlist for final MVP in 2022 for Portland, playing for the other team now, playing for Chicago. And you look at the outside back play between these two teams and you go, yeah, it looks like Portland is actually lacking here a little bit in width. They were getting killed on the width. Reina Reyes was the player who conceded that penalty against Ludmilla. Greener OBs now. It makes an impact on the game. Goalkeeping, right? They sign a player like Arnold because they needed very desperately to solidify goalkeeping in the back. This in and of itself is a very different approach to the way Portland has always played, where they've always had sort of these homegrown keepers developed it by Nadine Ongerer, who is also no longer there. And instead they're bringing new players in to try to communicate, to try to fix those mistakes, right? The team just dealt out Janine Becky, and they also just dealt out and they just signed Alex Spanstra. So you've got the team there. They're moving forwards out and bringing forwards in. They move out Janine Becky for Raylan Turner. They sign Spanstra. Those are two great young forwards who I like a lot. This is kind of what I mean about where what's happening with Portland is a little bit confusing, because it's not like they're doing all of these shifts that don't make sense. I think that those are two great young forwards. They're also getting Morgan Weaver back from injury. But again, they maybe possibly lost poor Hina Sagita in this game. It looked like maybe she suffered a concussion. but it's just not about the attack. The attack is frustrated, but it doesn't mean that they aren't doing what they need to be doing. Smith had another very strong game despite not getting on the scoreline. They still have Christine Sinclair very involved, which I think is interesting at this point in her career. Jessie Fleming has not really been the impact signing that they were hoping for. In fact, right now they're trying to figure out how to get her properly on the pitch. They talked about this on the broadcast. Moultrie has had a little bit of a plateau year after a fabulous season last year, but that also makes sense with how much coaching change you have. So I'm really just curious to see what this means for Portland. It's maybe an everything's fine. And as we know, you don't have to finish in the top 4 to make a great run at the postseason. But I am also just like, this is not the team that they used to be. And maybe it is just one coaching change too many. Maybe it's too much internal promotion. We've seen a lot of internal promotion to those head coaching stations after just coach after coach after coach dating back to, 2021. You see some of these changes, some of these losing certain people in the back line and then having the people who stay get exposed, having the midfield not really make sense because your marquee midfield signing hasn't been the best fit. And again, maybe that's a coaching issue. Maybe it's something about the way that they're training. Maybe it's about understanding the style of play. They do a lot of nice business to get these young forwards in, which I think is fabulous, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the part of the pitch that needs the most attention. So I don't know. I never know what to do with alarm bells for this one because they're a good team. They are still above the playoff line, but they are slipping in a way that I have not seen the Portland Thorns slip in a long time. And there's only so much that those front office changes can do, again, to get momentum going. And then if you're losing momentum again at the end of the season with everybody fatigued, it's a little bit hard to get back. So maybe it turns around. Maybe Portland is looking at some more wholesale changes at the end of this season, but it's just been uncharacteristic from them. And I found that very, very interesting. So now switching over to the WNBA, which is in its final week of the regular season. If you can believe it, we are about to say goodbye to the WNBA regular season, which kind of as expected, we're seeing some major individual accolades get hit. We're hitting some milestones. We're seeing records get broken at the end of this week, the end of this season, which is a little bit complicated to parse out because there are two things happening here. There are some players who are doing extraordinary things. The game of women's basketball is evolving, and we are seeing versatility and accuracy and playmaking ability and efficiency like never before. But the other big topic of conversation in this is just the fact that we are going to be seeing these records fall pretty much every year for a while. And that has to do with season expansion. This is the second year of a 40-game season. Next year, there's been talk of expanding it to 44 games. And with every team that they add, and they want to be ambitious about adding teams, they've said, that is going to make an impact on how many games that you play. I think that it's good to expand the schedule. I want more WNBA games. The season has to get longer to be part of that national conversation. It just has to be a longer season, month to month. But also with more games come more points and more assists and more rebounds. And you're going to see records fall that not are asterisked, but I think the deeper conversation is, I think you're going to have to want to look at per game stats in a similar fashion to total stats, which is that your per games aren't always going to be as high as your totals when you expand seasons. However, this is my hot take. I don't care. My hot take is yes, we're going to be seeing records fall a lot in this era of the WNBA. And I'm like, that's very normal. These changes happen with sports all the time, with leagues all the time. It's not the WNBA's fault that it is still a young league that is still expanding and changing and growing. Things are going to get bigger. Seasons are going to get longer. And records are going to get broken. And that in the long annals of time will all work out, in my opinion. So, for example, A'ja Wilson is the new single season scoring holder. She breaks Jewel Lloyd's record from last year. Like I said, these expanded seasons. Last year, you saw like Stewie break the record, and then Jewel Lloyd broke the record, and then Stewie broke the record again, and then Jewel Lloyd broke the record. And so this time it was A'ja Wilson. And A'ja Wilson has been completely dominant in scoring, and her per game has been incredible, and her efficiency has been incredible. She is also probably this week going to break Angel Reese's single season rebound record. That's going to be a very fun battle to watch in the future of Reese and Wilson kind of battling it out for those boards. As we know, Reese got hurt, so she was not able to add to her tally for the last 6 or so games of the season. That makes a difference. That's kind of where I'm at with the expanded season, though, right? Like, is it being like, okay, so A'ja Wilson shouldn't get the rebound record because Angel Reese got hurt? Like, those circumstances are part of it, but that there are so many different ways that those circumstances match that I don't know. The larger season just doesn't really bug me. Wilson has also become the first player in WNBA history to hit 1,000 points in a season. And I say congratulations and many, many more. I want Wilson to be hitting 1,000 points. I want other players to be hitting 1,000 points. I want bigger numbers. I want more impressive stats. I want that. I crave it. And a lot of really good writing has been done about A'ja Wilson over the last couple of weeks. And we talk about her on this podcast all the time because what she's doing, I think I've said this before, is truly pushing the definition of what it means to be an all-around basketball player in women's basketball. We've never seen a season like this before from A'ja Wilson. There's been a lot of really good stuff written about. It's not just her offense, it's her defense too, right? 2-time reigning defensive player of the year. It's not just that she can score in the paint. She's really good at bringing the ball up. Like the Aces are able to function as well as they can because they have multiple people who can handle the ball. It's not just that her efficiency is so high because she's a post. Her efficiency is so high while she takes threes, right? It's all of it at once. And like I said, it's watching a player whose ceiling is so high consistently hit that ceiling over and over and over again. The consistency is ridiculous. And the Aces are following behind her. They are 8-2 in their last 10 games. Wilson playing incredibly well. They're getting more contributions from their guards. Chelsea Gray looks kind of finally back to her old self after maybe a long road back in 2024. The Aces are kind of slimly holding on to that 4th spot, but I think that they're going to keep it. And I think that, home court advantage for them is going to be huge in the playoffs. Other big winners this week. I want to talk about the Minnesota Lynx. They actually have the fair shout for the best team in the league right now for power ranking. To be honest, they're 9-1 in their last 10 games. They got another win over New York this weekend. They play New York really well. That's all I'm saying. The Lynx play New York really well. Nafisa Collier is playing very, very well. I think their tandems, God, I love the way the Lynx play. I love watching Courtney Williams bring the ball up, her being kind of that versatile kind of two-way guard. So good. Her mid-range is incredible. Watching Alana Smith play as well as she's been playing has been wonderful to see. Watching Kayla McBride sling it from 3. They just have such a coherent offense, and every single player has been empowered to play like their best self. And I think I really like them. I think, again, if there's a hot hand going into the postseason, I think I'd have to circle probably Minnesota, Las Vegas, and Indiana. Those are the ones that are feeling pretty good. Though, however, I do also want to shout out the Seattle Storm. Gabby Williams, good at basketball. Seems like that's been a big piece to helping them sort of solidify things going into the playoffs as they keep moving. I keep saying this, right? Big free agency. They've not looked exactly like a cohesive team all the time this season, but adding Gabby Williams after the Olympics has been a huge boost to them. But if we're talking about the biggest winners this week, this is going to be my little spotlight for WNBA, the Washington Mystics. I take it back. Last week, I was down on the Mystics. I said, I don't get it. I don't get why they're making this push just to finish outside of the playoff line. But hey, 1 week later, the Washington Mystics are in 8th place. They got a big win over Chicago last week. They split a 2-game series with Atlanta, who are the 2 other teams that they're competing with for that last spot in the playoffs. They're getting the results they need to hold on. They've got the tie break over those teams, and they're sitting on top of them in the standings right now. They started 0-12, and the ESPN pulled this stat that if the Mystics do end up making the playoffs, they would have the longest losing streak to start a season of any WNBA team ever to advance to the postseason. Really incredible turnaround. So I think the big question is, so what's the difference, right? Why is this happening? How are they making it this far? From what I've seen in recent weeks, I think it's fairly obvious, actually, which is that they have a really good offense. They have a really good offense. Even if you just look at some of the stats, and I'm not going to compare them to these teams that are pushing the top of the standings. I don't think that's fair. But I will compare them to Chicago, Atlanta, right? The 2 teams that they are battling for this position, right? The Mystics are second in the league in both three-pointers made and three-point percentage. They move the ball really well. They're 3rd in the league in assists per games. Stephanie Dolson, who is one of their bigs, is 2nd in the league in three-point percentage with a significant amount of attempts per game. It's not just that, right? Sometimes that percentage can be misleading because, you take 1 3 and you make it. Yeah, great. Your percentage is 100%, right? But that's not what's happening with Stephanie Dolson. She takes on some of that load from the 3-point range, and she does a really, really nice job. You compare those stats, right, to Chicago and Atlanta. Chicago is last in 3-point attempts. They don't have a great assist to turnover ratio, and they're very injured. Now, the Mystics have been dealing with injuries too, but Chicago, once they lost Reese, it really felt like the wheels started to fall off. Atlanta is 9th in 3 points made, and they're last in assists per game. And they are 11th in 3-point percentage. just these are not two functioning offenses the same way that Washington has a functioning offense. They are more well-rounded than their direct competition, and they've unlocked some really nice help defense. I think another good example is Aaliyah Edwards having just a really low-key nice rookie season. So if you do play a team like Chicago and you play a team with Camila Cardoso, you can get that help in the paint. And so not only have you nullified what other teams can do inside, but if you are going to outclip them from three, that's it, right? Now, this is not going to come down to head-to-head necessarily. Washington got their head-to-head moment, right? They got that the last 2 weeks. They beat Chicago, and then they split 2 games against Atlanta. So it's going to come down to strength of schedule this week. The final 2 games, Chicago and Atlanta also can't both win out because they play each other this week. But Washington has a tough out. They play New York, and then they play Indiana. Chicago can overtake, but then they probably have to take out Atlanta and then beat the Sun to get there. Atlanta plays Chicago, and then they play the Liberty. These are some tough outs for these 3 teams. So I'm gonna switch. I'm gonna switch what I thought. I'm gonna go back to the team with the best functioning offense, which is by all accounts the Mystics. I think that looks to me like a playoff team, and that looks to me like a team that is deserving of that final 8th spot. So shout out to the Mystics. But maybe my final WNBA thought in that respect is last week I was sort of maligning this choice, right, by the Mystics to make this push to the playoffs. I didn't understand it. I was thinking, you've got the lottery, you've got a generational player coming into the league next year in Paige Beckers. Why would you affect your standing when you could tank? Now, as we know, tanking is not a direct science, right? You're only really tanking for percentage points. I do understand that. I think maybe, again, Washington having an offense that works is more important than a full tank, right? Maybe they're just setting the stage for free agents to be able to see themselves in Washington, or for other draft picks to see themselves in Washington, because they do have a coherent offense, And then I also just think that Golden State does make some of this a little bit weird. I was thinking about this in the context of Chicago, which has held that 8th spot for a while and then have now dropped out of it. What does that mean for them? There's been conjecture that Golden State is going to take the 5th spot in the draft, so the first non-lottery spot. So if you get 8th this year, you might actually draft as if you got 7th because of the expansion of the league. But that has not been confirmed. I don't think people know exactly what's going to happen with the college draft and with the expansion draft. So maybe this is truly out of respect. I do respect Atlanta, Chicago, and Washington all really going for it, because there is a lot to be determined in this offseason. I think there's going to be a lot of change, and an expansion year is a very strange year. You have to prepare for a lot of different scenarios, and nothing is guaranteed. So yeah, they're all going for it. Like I said, I like Washington, I think, at this point, but also for a team like Chicago, a team like Atlanta, getting into that lottery is probably not the worst thing in the world. So fascinated to see how this all plays out. There's that one final spot to go for, and everyone else is playing for seeding. We'll see. But yeah, it's been a fabulous WNBA season. Like I said, bigger, better, more points, more rebounds, more assists. That's what I want. That's what I want to see. And I should have pointed that out too. Caitlin Clark broke the assist. It's like so much is happening that I'm like, oh yeah, by the way, Caitlin Clark broke the assist record for a single season. If I missed that earlier, Indiana's still playing incredibly well. Very, very happy to see that team put it all together. But yeah, it's going to be a rockin' postseason, final race to the end here. And just enjoy it. Just enjoy the greatness that you're seeing while you're seeing it. Because, yeah, like I said, a season like Wilson's, like Clark's, you just don't see it all the time. So I'm very excited for the future, but I'm also enjoying the present on this one. And then a couple quick shout outs to other sports. I want to thank everybody who commented on last week's episode to tell me about volleyball, because I was curious. I want to shout out a couple comments we got about the parity in volleyball right now. I want to shout out user Carolyn Wright 328. She says, avid NCAA volleyball fan here. There is so much parity in women's volleyball in college, and while there have been a wild number of upsets in the first few weeks of non-con, like I said, I can't say I'm surprised by that as someone who's been paying close attention over the past few years. The number of teams that could genuinely contend for a national title grows every year. It makes it so fun to watch. Increased media coverage, investment, and the introduction of 2 professional leagues within the U.S., which we never had before, are all helping grow participation and competition within the sport. I agree. Very exciting. I also got a comment from the user Adventures in Pages. Same thing. Hey, Claire, big NCAA volleyball fan here. To answer your question, yes. I think volleyball is capitalizing on its success, and the choice for a lot of these top 10 teams to schedule postseason style matches week 1 has been great. It reminds me of the Clearwater tournament that was started for softball 5 or 6 years ago, where most of the teams invited were in the Women's College World Series in the last season or the year before. It draws so much engagement and huge crowds. And basically just that's also a good point, right? Is that this non-conference scheduling isn't happening by by chance, right? People are scheduling very ambitiously. They're seeing the potential of these big events. I think we have another huge one coming up this week. This Wednesday, there are some really fabulous in-state rivalry games and top ranked opponents playing each other. Great time to be alive and a volleyball fan. Really, really exciting. So thank you everyone who commented. I'm going to keep an eye. I'm excited to really kind of dig into volleyball a little bit more as the weeks go on, because again, I think it is that perfect cauldron of growing parity. We've seen the great equalizer across all college sports of NIL and the transfer portal. And like you said, just some smart scheduling before we get into conference play. And to that point, Texas Weird Starts continues. They got swept by Stanford this weekend, and they have to play. They're playing Baylor this week. Louisville looks sharp. They beat Creighton in the second of ESPN's. They had a coverage doubleheader on Sunday. Some really, really big ones coming up this Wednesday. But yeah, it looks like Texas has still not quite figured it out. So keep an eye on that as well. And then my final shout out of the week is to the U.S. Women's National Team U20s, who made me look like a real dunce on Twitter last night. I'm watching this game. Germany goes up 2-0 in the second half stoppage time. I think that's it. Good job to the U.S. They make the quarterfinals of the U20 World Cup. Well done. Wrap it up. And then they come back in the 98th and the 99th minute to force extra time. 2 unanswered goals at the very, very end of the game to force the game into extras. No one scores in extras. The U.S. advances over Germany 3-1 in penalty kicks. It's like the craziest comeback I've ever seen. I love U20 soccer. They're so talented, and the control is just not there. So huge shout out to the U.S. Women's National Team U20s. This has been a fabulous tournament for them already. The U20s were in a bit of maybe a crisis, you would say. They got grouped their last 2 World Cups. They haven't won a World Cup since 2012. You could tell that the program was taking it seriously, because you're seeing top college players and pros get pulled from their professional and college clubs to do this. That is a team taking this seriously. And I'm very, very happy that the seriousness with which this has been taken is being rewarded by a semifinal bid. Allie Sentnor having another fabulous tournament. Like I think that Sentnor is in the wrong position to win NWSL Rookie of the Year, not least because she's missing a couple of games for this tournament, which I think is the right call, absolutely. And just because of how well Croy Bethune played before her injury, but just one to watch. It's really cool to see these players who are making that leap and playing professionally, doing so well in the youth levels as well, because that's so important to the pipeline. And then I also just want to shout out Florida State's Jordan Dudley, who scored the other goal in stoppage time to send this one to Pens. They play North Korea in the semifinals. If you get a chance to check that out, I really would. I highly recommend it. Like I said, U20 soccer is wacky, but this has been a nice moment for the U.S. Women's National Team program to see the investment not only in cultivating these players and compiling the right group, and these players being very ambitious and going and playing for professional clubs under the age of 20, but they took it seriously and they're getting results. And so I think if there was this reset of seriousness on the women's program, once there was this sort of return to form in 2024, we're seeing it on multiple levels, and they should feel very, very good about that as well. So that has been this week's episode of The Late Sub. We'll have more for you next week. There's so much to dig into: soccer, basketball, volleyball. We got more winter sports coming up. I'm ready for some chill in the air. It's too warm. I want it to be fall. I want it to be autumnal. Shout out to a producer extraordinaire, Parker Fenton. I have been your host, Claire Watkins, and we will talk to you next time.